Today I realized I'm in the Holy Land. Only took me 7 days. Fitting. This realization came at a very unexpected moment as well. We woke up today at 4:30 in the morning to walk the Via Dolorosa, or the path that Jesus walked on the way to his crucifixion. You'd think I would have gotten a bit emotional there, but I didn't. I was admittedly a bit of a zombie, as I didn't get much sleep last night. It was a very special experience, for sure, but it hadn't really sunken into me quite yet. The Way of the Cross leads straight into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the church built over the place Jesus was crucified and buried. We all lined up to touch the spot he was crucified on. You'd think that I would have felt something significant there, and I mean, sure, I felt the sanctity of the place, but I personally didn't feel anything earth-shattering. Finally, we arrived at Jesus' tomb, where we were scheduled to celebrate Mass. We had to sit on some benches in front of the tomb for about 45 minutes beforehand. By this point, I was exhausted already, had a bit of a headache. I tried to journal as I usually have been throughout the pilgrimage, but I couldn't. My mind was kind of blank, which was surprising because I've been writing at every site we've visited. Now, I did read through every prayer request that people had sent me, so if you asked me for prayers in the Holy Land, I got you. As we were sitting there waiting for Mass to start, I felt kinda, I had hoped to have some sort of great spiritual experience, but between feeling tired, a bit of a headache, and a complete lack of inspiration to write, I honestly felt so drained that I thought to myself, well, there's no way I could feel anything peculiar at this point. I mean, here I was, feet away from the place that Jesus died, was buried, and was resurrected. And the experience wasn't exactly the romantic scene I'd envisioned in my head. But then, the Mass started. It was a sung Mass in Latin, as in it wasn't a traditional Latin Mass, it was the modern Mass in Latin. The Mass was chanted by monks with an organ in the background. Other than it being at the place of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, it wasn't especially out of the ordinary for a Mass. Here's where things got interesting. The moment the monks leading the choir opened their mouths for the processional hymn, I started tearing up. I admit it. I cried throughout that entire Mass from start to finish. And I felt fully awake, fully aware, fully energized, and fully enraptured by love. I won't go into too much detail, very personal experience, but those of you who've ever just felt overwhelmed with spiritual affection know exactly how I felt. Here's an admission, I have the attention span of a gerbil. Usually I have a very difficult time concentrating during the Mass. But today, I soaked in every moment. Even though it was in Latin, I clung to every word. I mean, we could understand the translations, as if Jesus was speaking from the cross or from the tomb. This is tied for first place as the most special Mass I've ever been to in my whole life. I can go into that other Mass one day at a later time. I have to give so much credit to Steve and Janet Ray, who run Footprints of God pilgrimages. They arranged for us to attend this Mass. We were right in front of the tomb, and after Mass, we were the first group to enter it. A few minutes into the Mass, two things came to mind. First, I need a tissue. Second, places and things are only as meaningful as their communities make them. Let me explain. If you'd never seen an Italian flag before and someone handed you one, you probably wouldn't think much of it. Maybe you'd even use it as a doormat or a towel. And any good Italian would be furious if you did that, since to them that flag symbolizes to them so much more. Likewise, if I was walking on a tribal trail and picked up a stick that the tribal people considered sacred but had no idea about it, that staff would not be sacred to me. Things only have as much power and meaning as they are given by their communities, and Catholic relics and sacred spaces are no different. Let me explain where I'm going with this. Technically speaking, a geologist could argue that given environmental and architectural changes, the soil I've been walking on technically isn't the exact same soil Jesus walked on. A few people have even asked questions like, how do we know this was the exact spot at which Jesus took up his cross? Or how do we know this was the exact spot of the feeding of the 5,000? What I realized at Mass, though, was it doesn't matter if that exact part of the rock I'm touching was touched by Jesus 2,000 years ago. It doesn't matter if Jesus was standing on this exact spot or a few yards or even miles away. The point is that the Catholic Church, our community, recognizes what these places represent, what they stand for. They are places that ooze God's presence because of the sanctity that the Church, guided by the Holy Spirit, has invested into them. We're talking about places that have been visited and venerated by popes and saints, places whose communities have spilled blood defending, places that millions of pilgrims break their backs and wallets to get to every year. Most of all, and this is what I'm building to, these are places that are animated by the holy sacrifice that is the Mass. And without the Mass, these places carry significantly less meaning. Without the Mass, they become museums. Their objects and relics become magic trinkets that carry superstitious powers. We do not worship relics. Relics are signs that point to God, and their signification is animated by the celebration of the Mass, in which they cease to be mere signs of God and become participants in Christ's sacrifice that occurs again every week in the Eucharist. This, in my opinion, is why nothing today really spiritually moved me until the Mass began. Before that, I was walking in the general area that Jesus walked in, which is cool, but we don't go on pilgrimage to follow Jesus like a celebrity. We go on pilgrimage to be joined to Jesus in a special way that is ultimately manifest in the Mass. And yes, there are people who experience spiritual enrichment around relics outside the Mass. I personally felt overwhelmed at Our Lady of Fatima's statue in Portugal. But I must stress again that the purpose of a relic is to be a sign that directs us to God, who is literally present to us in the Eucharist at Mass. A good pilgrimage site or relic should deepen your commitment to the Mass. Also, you aren't supposed to perform the Mass just anywhere. The performance of the Mass at a place beyond a diocesan church or a house Mass is significant. That's why the Vatican prohibits priests from performing Masses at places whose miracles haven't been validated yet. Like I said before, the molecular composition of Jerusalem has changed so much in the last 2,000 years, between environmental factors, wars, renovations, etc., that you can make a philosophical argument that it isn't the same place anymore. You could also argue that we breathe the same air as Jesus did. Oxygen is a physical, tangible thing on a molecular level, so shouldn't everywhere be considered the Holy Land? The same argument could be made for water, as rain evaporates and then falls on different locations. Maybe you drank or swam in the same water that Jesus drank or walked on. These arguments, which I don't even necessarily agree with, completely miss the purpose of pilgrimage sites and relics, which leads me to my 3 points. First, the Mass is the cornerstone of all Christian life. Communities dictate the importance of places and things. Communities sanctify them with their recognition that they symbolize something much more important than how they ordinarily appear. To a caveman, an Italian flag is a beach towel. To an Italian, that flag is their birthright and heritage. Our community is the Church. The way we express recognition of a sacred site or relic is its incorporation into the celebration of the Mass. Without the Mass, the eternal sacrifice that leads to salvation, we are severed from the person who we are drawn into relationship, and that is God. I felt that as these relics were transformed from artifacts into living, breathing participants in the Mass. Second, now this is directed at both skeptics of these sacred sites and believers who are obsessed with precision. People who would be shattered if they found out that the Transfiguration really occurred a football field away from the Church of the Transfiguration. We do not worship holy sites and relics. They are signs that direct us to greater communion with God in prayer at the Mass. They are not substitutes for the Mass, and they aren't magic trinkets that will grant us good luck if we clutch them. That can easily lead into superstition. The Mass is more important than any relic or pilgrimage spot because it is the only place in the world where we can say with 100% accuracy that God is fully present. That brings me to my last point. All Masses are equal in value. Yes, there are things you can do to make it easier for people to get in their spiritual zone, things like adding incense, featuring music in a style considered sacred according to your culture, or having Mass at a sacred location, whether it be overlooking a beautiful valley in the Pacific Northwest or 10 feet away from Jesus' tomb. I owe God so much. There are also things you can do to disrupt people from being in that spiritual zone. Like, I don't think a Mass with music played on the kazoo would be very effective, nor would one with giant puppets and weird dancing. If you know, you know. That said, the Mass is the Mass, and it doesn't matter if you're in Jerusalem or on a backpacking trip with a priest. You could be at a solemn High Latin Mass in Rome, or in a humble Appalachian parish with one guy on the banjo who can't sing. God is there. And God didn't just all of a sudden decide that He loves me a little extra now that I'm in the Holy Land. God loved me and has always loved me the same amount. So my advice to people who feel that love a little extra because their surroundings put you in that spiritual zone a little better is to remember, God always loves you that much and more. We just need to open our eyes to see it. Look, this video isn't meant to detract from relics and pilgrimages. Rather, it's meant to resituate them in the greater context of the Mass. If we don't do that, these sites risk becoming museums and places of superstition. One final point. At the beginning of this series, I mentioned that the last year of my life has felt rather turbulent. I'm happy to say that I now feel at peace, and it's a peace I haven't felt in a while. Let's see how long that lasts. Anyways, this concludes my weird, disjointed reflection series from the Holy Land. I guess it's fitting we end on a high note talking about the Mass. I'll release a video talking about the pilgrimage itself in depth. In it, I'll give a rundown of where we went, what we did, the quality of the experience, and advice I'd give to potential pilgrims. It'll be a review, more or less, of Steve Ray's Footprints of God pilgrimages. Better watch out, Steve. I'm gonna be brutally honest. Going forward, I'm not sure I'll do many more of these styles of videos. I prefer delving into theology more than I do talking about my personal life. But we'll see what happens. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Until next time, have a great day. God bless you.